Welcome to the EasyMobs kit for Playmaker, a Playmaker set of FSM scripts to allow you to create RPG and MMO style mobs very easily. It's not affiliated with Playmaker or Huton Games, and Playmaker must be purchased separately in order for these FSMs to work. It also uses models that have legacy animations currently at this state of its development. Um, it hasn't been used with Mechanim. It's not set up for Mechanim, but it works with models with legacy animations. There are many assets available to allow you to create animations for your legacy models. Skelly, for one, is a good program or a good asset. Also on the asset store, not affiliated with EasyMobs as well. There's also a free asset to allow you to convert Mechanim animations to legacy for your models. So legacy still has a use even in Unity 5. And this kit is for those older models. I'm also using the Cartoon Zombies kit asset store models. They are available for purchase on the asset store, and they are also not affiliated with EasyMobs. We have our zombie model set up. This is the point you'd be at the end of the setup video if you're following the EasyMobs manual PDF. I'm not going to be covering and recovering the setup, but this is where you'd be with your command, your core object with the FSM and the combat SFSM, with your model attached to it as the animation component, as a child of your core, and you have your idle FSM and your combat FSM. To set up your idle chain, the idle FSM is a loop that loops through the different portions of it. In a loop, while it's waiting for contact with the player, then it triggers the combat FSM that then handles the combat portion till that's over, and then sends the actions back to the idle state. The green areas are configuration states. You can configure basically everything in here to how you want it, how long you want the idles, what you want to play when, portions of this you want to skip or don't want to use, are all in these well documented configuration states. Bypass portions, adjust your variables for different areas, task and mob related, board behaviors, which we'll cover separately, and in your mob parameters, your hit points and movement values. Your blue states require an animation component. That's where you're seeing the errors. Some blue states in the areas that are bypassed by default have their animation component turned off to avoid errors. If you use these, you activate them, then you can activate and include your animation. Simply turn them on. Same with the sound. You can I have included the actions just for ease of use, and you can turn those on and add your sounds or add other actions to these states once you understand what it's doing. To set up your initial simple idle, you have your idle main, which is the beginning idle state. You drag your model itself into the object, not the command core, the actual model underneath that has the animation component. And then you specify the animation it'll list all the animations available to that model. The normal animation, you choose how long it idles in this state before it goes to the enhancers. Enhancers are simple one-shot animations that add more liveliness to your mob. So again, you drag your model in and choose. This model has two: idle look around and an idle scratch head. The weight is a value between 0.01 and a whole value of 1. And it's on a 100% scale, so that's what it is. 0.5 is 50% of the time. It'll choose between these. If you want to play 70% of the time, it'd be 0.7, 0.3, and the other one would be 70% to 30% that it would play these as it randomized through. Even on your single animations, I use a random action so you can add more animations. If you had several idle animations, you could have several. If you want one specific, just have one. It works well for both multiples and singles. If you don't have, say, enhancers, you can bypass this in the configuration stage. Next, we'll move to your rotation, your mob changing face. It's changing its face each pass. And the animation is, in this case, a simple walk. It's just so he doesn't appear to be turned by exterior forces. It then moves to the wander. This is your actual movement, and it requires the well, these have already been set up through when I was testing with it earlier, but that's why there's already values in here. But you choose a walk, you run, other type. If you had say a gargoyle that flew and as a move type, we use just a funny walk. Or a werewolf that run around on all fours as a type. Pose transition, if you have a transition between the other type, say a dragon that gets up and stretches its wings and then launches into flight, that's where you could do the start of the movement transition animation and the end of the where he landed and folded his wings up. Transitions that are larger than just a simple blend, you can include those here by activating the action if you had those transitions for the other. And like I said, you can specify what movement types or have it randomly pick a movement type. You set that up in the configurations yourself. Delay before is just a simple idle that makes the transition to board from movement to the board behavior less abrupt. It's just a very short duration idle. Then board behaviors are checked and the loops. Tasks and board behaviors are bypassed by default. Their more advanced tasks are a waypoint patrol. The three examples provide. One's a gather task, where the mob goes to an object that's tagged with gather. He performs the number of specified actions as default to 10. Actually increments a gather variable to that value and then looks for a drop-off object with a drop-off tag. Goes to that drop-off item and then increments a variable in that drop-off item and continues to repeat that back and forth until the drop-off value is the specified value default of 100, and then it ends that task. It actually is a gather task mob, and that tasks are run first, and that would be his primary task. Most of the idle chain would be ignored while it would perform this task explicitly. The second example would be a patrol task where you set up waypoints, and that's he will move between these waypoints, and each time it's the way it's currently set. Each time he reaches a waypoint, it'll make a pass through the idle chain, an abbreviated portion. It disables parts of the idle chain, like the wander and the change of facing, but it'll idle through just so he's not constantly moving. He'll stop at a waypoint, idle for a second, and then head to the next waypoint. And then there's a plant and create task where the mob would, at each point in its wander, it could plant a tree or a landmine or a flower or whatever you wanted it to do. Those are tasks if you had them. The board behaviors are similar, but they don't actually accomplish anything. There's no variables incremented. A board behavior is triggered after so many passes through the idle loop, which you specified in the board configurations. Currently, it's set to random between 3 to 6 passes through the idle loop. It could trigger a board event. Board behavior. Board behaviors can either play a longer animation similar to the idle enhancers, but a longer animation. Say you had a goblin mob that had an animation where he beats on a skin drum. You could have it after he idles for so long, there's no interaction with the player. It triggers this animation where he sits down and starts beating on the drum for a few seconds. That's an example of the one-shot loop, and it'll play it for the specified time, and then it'll exit back into the idle chain and then repeat for how many ever passes before it randomly selects another board event. You also have a desire behavior example where the mob will look for an object in the scene with the desirable tag. He'll then go to it if it's within the specified distance that you allow, and then he'll perform a set number of actions for a certain count if you have it set up, for a certain time if you have it set up that way. It defaults to the count setup, but it explains how to set up the other as well. And a wait count would be for a looping animation. A work count would be for one-shot and type animations. Example with this zombie would be if there was a body or piles of meat in the scene that had the desirable tag on it. If he ended his wandering within the specified distance when this board behavior was triggered, he could go to it and perform his crouching eat on it for a certain amount of passes, and then, which we'll go ahead and set that up. We'll do is move to, by default, these are turned off so we don't get errors. Simply turn them on. He's going to shamble to it. We're going to do a work count because we're going to use a one-shot crouch eat animation. And it also has a delay before, so the transition isn't as abrupt when it goes back to the idle chain, and we use the idle normal. Now, since we have this, we have to turn it on in the bypass because by default the board behaviors are turned off. You simply change this value to 1, go into the board configurations. We're going to reduce the time here because we don't want to wait too long, 1 to 3 seconds. It'll board, and let's change the distance that he'll go to make sure he finds the object. The rest of that looks good. Okay, and let's go ahead and launch it. I'm going to stay in scene mode so you can see. That's why we'll have these gizmos up, but I can navigate easier. Alright, he's idling. He played an enhancer. He's moving. Now, I have these number values set up really open. He just triggered a desire. Since we only had it going randomly 1 through 3, it triggered very quick. But this is a board behavior. He found a desirable object with a tag. He went to it. He's performing his eat. Now he's back into his idle loop. And once again, we had that set up very quick. You could have it to where it only did that 10 passes through the idle loop. Around a random amount. We had it set up very quick for demonstration. But he's idling. He's in his idle mode. He'll play an idle enhancer. There's the enhancer scratching his head. He's doing his rotation and a movement. And like I said, his values are set very low. You could have him wander a lot farther and idle for a lot longer, however you specify. He'll trigger another board event pretty quick here with the way we have it set up currently. Oh, see, he triggered his board event. He went back to the desirable, and he's eating again. And this could be a board event, could be a blacksmith shop. You may have him just standing there in an idle with an enhancer of looking around, and then his board behavior could be periodically he beats on the anvil or goes over to the bellow. With the tasks, you could have his task be beating on the anvil, increasing an inventory amount of swords, and then the board behavior that would trigger would be he walks over to the bellows and pumps it a few times, then goes back to his task action of beating. You can set up all kind of silliness with the EasyMobs, and he's back to eating again. And that's the idle FSM setup in a nutshell. I'll cover board and task behaviors probably in another video a little more in depth. The second part of the setup is the combat FSM. Those are the final four errors you see. We edit that FSM, and it's simply adding the animations. The return to the original position is this is when he can't find the player, or the player tries to lead him away and he never engages combat. He'll break combat and go back to the position he was at when he first detected the player. We'll have him run back. Your melee animation, and you can have more than one if you wanted. Move into combat animation, run, and we have this one as a hostile warn. There's 3 states you can set your mob up in. The wary animations are turned off by default. And this will be a rotation animation. And that weight was 2. I'm going to adjust this, but if it's 2, it needs to be converted back to 1, or else it would never play. The 3 states are aggressive, hostile, and wary. Aggressive, the mob will immediately, when it detects a player within its range, it'll immediately go to and attack it. Hostile, the mob will warn the player playing the warn animation. Say a grizzly bear that growls first, or an orc that bangs on its shield prior to attacking. And it'll do that for the specified time, and then it'll retest to see if the player is within the range. If it still is, it goes to aggressive mode and attacks. And then third type would be wary. Every time the player comes within range, the mob will run in an away vector, and then retest to see if it got away. And if not, it will repeat. It'll always try to run away from the player. And it loops through these. If the player's within range, it stays in this combat state till he's not, and then it goes back to the idle state. And that's pretty much it for the overview of the EasyMobs, idle, and the combat FSM.